inviting me. Okay. Oh. No, I just got a message that it's being recorded, and okay, now everything is okay again. So yes, I will just give an overview of mental health in academia today, with a focus on PhD students. I'm not completely sure whether everyone in the audience is a PhD or whether they are also master students. I was under the impression that it was mostly PhD, so then it should be relevant to you. So I will start with some overviews about recent studies of the last 4 or 5 years about mental health in academia and PhD students. And then the more important part is the proposals for improvement of the work situation in academia. So normally I start with an overview about mental health disorders in general. I suppose because you're a psychology audience, that won't be necessary too much, but just as a refresher, about 1/3 of people will suffer from a mental health disorder in their lifetime in general, regardless of their intelligence or their education or profession. And there have been several surveys worldwide. Here I show a graph of the World Mental Health Survey, which for instance shows that the US has the highest prevalence of mental health disorders, around 46-48%. And in Europe, it's between 20 and 30 something percent. And for instance, in China, it's only 15-16%. Of course, some factors that are of influence of these prevalences is methodology, survey in the country, also cultural. There are really changes or differences in prevalence. But there's also an influence of how much of a taboo it is to talk about mental health disorders. So for instance, you should wonder whether you really believe that there's only a prevalence of 15% in China. But there are for sure differences. Also important to keep in mind is that this graph is only about diagnosis, people meeting the criteria for that. So psychological suffering in general is inevitably higher. And only 8-14% of the people meeting the criteria for a diagnosis actually seeks treatment, which implies a taboo also in developed countries. And this taboo is partly explainable by it's not really visible for a person. If you are suffering from a mental health disorder, there's no pathological process that will actually lead to death. And in general, we have a tendency to find deathly diseases worse. But actually, mental health disorders are among the most burdensome, partly because it usually has an early age of onset. And when a person has a mental health disorder, it's often chronic or recurrent. So they spend a lot of time of their life in some state of disability, which also has some implications for the economy in general in terms of productivity of an individual person and of treatment costs for society in general. So there's an estimate for Europe of around 418 billion euros in 2010. So it's quite old and it's probably higher nowadays. I think this time, obviously there's different types of mental health disorders. I suppose I do not have to explain this to this audience. Just important to keep in mind is that the anxiety and mood disorders are most relevant for work environment in general, and in this case, then the academic work environment. So we'll come back to that later. Causes that relates to the causes of mental health disorders. There's always a genetic component and environmental component for depression and anxiety disorders. This ranges between 30% to 67%, depending on the exact anxiety disorder. So there's always a vulnerability or resilience and environmental influences that can trigger or cause mental health disorder or psychological suffering in an individual. The link, again, this is probably a slide that you're very familiar with. So the link between experiencing stress and having a psychological response and also a physiological response is the HPA-axis. So you experience stress, your hypothalamus produces CRH, your pituitary gland produces ACTH, and your adrenal glands produce cortisol, which in turn affects the brain and many other organs. And this is completely normal. Of course, this is useful, but in situations where you are repeatedly and chronically exposed to high levels of stress and therefore of stress hormones in your body, this can lead to physiological and therefore also psychological and psychiatric effects in your brain and body. So factors that cause stress in general is, of course, like having a healthy lifestyle or just state, intelligence, education relevant to the academic world, of course, also, because you're talking about highly intelligent, highly educated people, which in general have a higher level of resilience against mental health disorders. But as you will see in some of the next slides, it's not working that well in the PhD academic environment, at least. And of course, many different things, housing situation, your financial situation, anything is of influence on your experience of stress and therefore on your mental health. And some of those things are also related to your work environment. If you're not being paid very well, it's hard to have a proper financial or housing situation. So to come to the actual topic, mental health in academia, this has really seen a surge of attention and of publications related to it in the last 5 years. So, for instance, here in the top panel is a study by Beiter et al., which examined undergraduate students, so bachelor students in the US, and they found what seems like moderate levels of the experience of stress or anxiety and depressive symptoms, but actually they're almost double or at least quite increased levels of these symptoms, especially for that age group. If you look at more senior, so actual graduate students, as it's called in the US, so that's a master and PhDs, but 90% of these of this survey met the criteria for PhD students. We saw a massive increase of prevalence in anxiety and depression skill symptoms, of 41 and 39% compared to 6% in the general population. This again was emphasized in 2017 in Nature and also in publications later on in Nature. Nature has really paid attention to this topic in recent years, where a survey found that 25% of people were worried about their mental health and 12% sought assistance. So this is higher than normal. For more senior academic staff, it's less often examined. It's also a bit more complicated, I suppose, to study people in more senior academic positions. But there has been a report in the UK which also found a 37% prevalence of mental health disorders or of psychological suffering. I don't think this was diagnosis in postdocs and professors and other senior academic staff. So specifically, just to explain the methodology behind studies like that, they generally use the general health questionnaire, which can consist of 28 or 12 items. And depending on the scores, if you score more than 4 items on the GHQ-12 test, you have a very high risk of developing a mental health disorder later on. Of course, it can never be a diagnostic tool because you're doing a survey and not a diagnostic session, but it's a good indicator of the likelihood of people developing mental health diagnosis problems, but definitely also for psychological suffering. So obviously, if you scored 3 items positive on a score like this, that doesn't mean that it's good. 0 would be ideal, but that's too ideal, I suppose. So specifically for PhD candidates, there's been landmark study, I would say, in 2017 by Katja Levesque in Belgium with you. I think even of Louvain, but I always mix up Liège and Louvain, so forgive me for that. In any case, they examined PhD candidates and compared them to people with an equal level of education, except for the PhD part, of course, and with higher education, so bachelor and master students, and of highly educated employees. And they found that in the PhD population, 51% experienced psychological stress and 32% were at a moderate or severe level, so scoring 4 items or more positive on this GHQ questionnaire. So therefore having a high chance of developing psychiatric disorders at some point. And this was compared to the control groups between 1.8 and 2.8 times higher. So really, especially compared to highly educated people or employees, 2.5 times higher. So there's something specific in the academic work environment which causes people that are relatively the same in all other aspects to experience psychological stress and therefore to be at risk for developing psychiatric disorders, which is obviously really problematic. That was one of the landmark studies. After that, a lot of attention came. It was one of the most published or cited, I should say, studies in 2017-18. And based on that, more universities, student associations, and other institutes were paying attention to it. So just an example, this is not an exhaustive list. In Leiden, here in the Netherlands, there was a confirmatory study which found a similar, or actually a little bit higher, even 38% of people scoring 4 items positive on this general health questionnaire. And in Spain, they had a similar study. They didn't use the general health questionnaire, but they were focused on burnout specifically. And depending on the item of the skill that they used, they found 58 to 80% people scoring moderate to severe scores. So that's huge. And mainly on the emotional exhaustion and the depersonalization scores of these items. And they compared it to higher education students and to university or higher education teachers and university students. And they found that it was massively increased compared to those groups. So these 3 studies all show the same phenomenon of mental or being at risk for mental health, developing mental health disorders, and experiencing psychological stress is much higher among PhD students than among people with a similar level of education or intelligence also, therefore, but different professions. So one of the studies that I was involved in, Colleen already mentioned it, I did my PhD in Munich in Germany, and I was part of the Max Planck Society. So just to sketch the German academic landscape, in Germany, you can do your PhD at a university in one of the 16 states, or at one of the scientific societies. And you have the Max Planck Society, you have the Leibniz Association, and the Fraunhofer Society. I think I always mixed up the association, or I think it's the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft in German. So those 3 societies are quite big and very prestigious. And they have each their own PhD representative body, at least nowadays. And for Leibniz, they developed this in 2016. And when I was in the board of the Max Planck PhD Net, we also sought collaboration with these other institutes or these other societies. And that has been called N2, so the network of PhD associations of the German scientific societies. And one of the things that I did is jointly organize surveys among their members. So just to sketch the size of these societies. So Max Planck is, I think, is the biggest, and it has around 5,000 PhD students each year. And the Helmholtz and Leibniz are also several thousand. So together, this is a survey in potentially 15,000 PhD students, so it's quite big. And 2018 and 19, I think now again, but the most recent surveys from 2019, questionnaires about everything, not just mental health, but also like, are you on a contract or a stipend, or how much are you being paid, your career perspectives, everything. But they included mental health in the 2019 survey, which is nice because then you have here, I showed I don't think I have a pointer, but here in the lowest section, you see the figures for each of the 3 societies and their survey in 2019, and they used the state and trade anxiety index and the PHQ-9 for depression. And they found, again, massive amounts of anxiety and also of depression, or a little bit less of depression, but still much elevated. So around 60, 65, 67, depending on the exact survey, of both state and trade anxieties among PhD students, which is a lot higher than in the general population. And around 17 or 15 for the Leibniz Association for the experience of depression symptoms, which is more than double or almost double the prevalence in the general population. And they also found some risk factors of, well, being female. This is in line with the general population also for anxiety disorders, being part of the biomedical or medical sections, again, in line with international studies, which show that the work environment is worse, apparently, in medical schools or in biomedical research. With workload, with the relationship with the supervisor, with the contract type, that all makes sense, and I will come back to it later, or actually here already. So I've shown a few studies, and there's a lot of reports, not all of which I showed, but in general, there's a long list of factors that might impact your mental health in academia. So your work-life balance, your contract situation, and your salary level, the demands, the relationship with your supervisor, all makes perfect sense. Those studies did not necessarily find a causal relationship, but the power of most of those studies was not sufficient for that, and also those studies were not designed to determine causal relationships. I think all of these aspects are important, so I will come back to a few of them. I wanted to mention or to show this study here by a Greek girl. I'm sorry, it's hard to pronounce that name. But it gives a very nice overview of some of the factors and of a lot of the studies in recent years. This is of 2020, this review. And also even of some of the proposals for improvement. So if you're interested in this topic, you could definitely check out this article. So based on the findings and our own findings in Germany, we wrote an article with N2, me and some other people, about suggestions for improvement. There it's important to realize that, of course, there are several levels where you can address the mental health crisis in academia. And one important level is, of course, the personal level. There's always a personal aspect, like I said, like your housing situation, your financial, your education level, and your personality and cognitive function, and so on. It's a bit beyond the scope of this presentation, so I want to focus on the institutional level, where you have more influence as an employee and as a PhD candidate, and where an institute, where a university or another institute can actually take responsibility. And then there's, of course, the systemic level. I will come back shortly to the systemic level later, but I want to focus on the institutional level first. And we divided that in 6 subtopics: so supervision, financial security, job security, work demands and balance with your life, career perspectives, administrative and material support, and your social environment. So we'll go back to each of these in the next few slides. So first of all, supervision. this is definitely the most mentioned frustration point and also aspect influencing your by PhD students themselves. I think it's important that it's not supervision alone. It's actually not even supervision per se. In the majority, I would say, that influences mental health, but it's definitely important. And another important aspect is that even if you have a good working relationship with your supervisor, it can still negatively impact your mental health. Because, of course, ideally you would have an involved supervisor who has concrete ideas of what your PhD project would look like, has even some plans and some input if things do not go according to plan, and they won't, because that would be weird. But still, like, it's important to keep in mind that someone became a supervisor by being good or sometimes even lucky within academia, and is maybe good as a researcher, but there's no training or no necessary skills in terms of management or super leadership or supervision, and that can have an influence. So some of the proposals to improve that is having a mandatory pre-written plan about what someone's PhD should contain. Of course, as a PhD should contribute to this. How should it look like? What could it look like? I mean, there are definitely, in the beginning, you cannot know how it will develop your research project. It depends also on the field that you're doing research in, obviously. It will be a bit more easy in humanities than in biomedical science or in engineering. You should have a timeline. You should have regular meetings to see how things are going, things that need to be adjusted or changed or anything. Very important would be to have an independent committee advising you on how things are going. Like, maybe it's easier for people who are independent to say, hey, you are really divergent from the original plan. Do you know, or do you realize that this might not lead to anything, that this is going to take more time? Sometimes that's okay, of course, but then there should be an independent committee that advises, like, hey, they're now going in a completely different direction, but it's worth exploring. So therefore, more funding would be very appropriate. It's also just strengthening your position as a PhD and also as a supervisor. Limiting the number of PhDs per supervisor is a very simple measure. We have extremes where people are supervising 30 PhD students and some postdocs, and obviously that's not very feasible. Something that a lot of institutes and universities are already introducing is leadership training, and also monitoring the performance of supervisors. I would like to couple that to it. It's not that common yet. So just to come back to those two, here's a slide about supervision training. Make a screenshot or a photo if you would like, because I will not go into the content of these trainings. But like I said, I mean, it's necessary that people that are responsible for other people, in this case PhDs, have some management, some leadership, some planning skills, and some of these courses can provide that. Then it's also linked to that. It's important to monitor how supervisors are doing and how the satisfaction of PhD candidates is developing. So I would strongly recommend every university and every institute to do an annual survey among PhDs, asking for some of the questions that I posted here, and some of the aspects that are important of PhD supervisor relationships, which enables you to identify the general satisfaction at an institute and also to identify problematic cases. Of course, a survey usually is anonymous. You can, I mean, it's up to the university or the institute to decide how to do that. In general, obviously, I realize that if a survey would show that one supervisor is particularly problematic or not, or just dysfunctional, or name it, it's very difficult to deliver that feedback, because they will know from whom it's coming, and it will potentially toxify the relationship with the PhD student. But I think having a general report of overall supervisor satisfaction at a university or at an institute is already very useful. It will also, together with the training already provided, will make supervisors aware of the things where they could improve or if their things are going well. And if there really is a problematic case, it's useful for at least for the administration of an institute to know, because ultimately, if things do not improve, then some supervisors should just not supervise PhD candidates anymore. When you talk about supervision, of course, you have the extremes, and then you come to power abuse or bullying or even sexual harassment. And in the last couple of years, probably in the light of the development in society where there's more emphasis on ethical behavior in the workplace, together with the Me Too movement, for instance, there have been some medialized examples of bullying cases which have been, well, shocking, really. For instance, in Germany, I think this is the most shocking, almost funny, except for the people involved, example. So there was a top empathy researcher of the Max Planck Society in Germany, and at one point she got angry with one of her PhD candidates for being pregnant, because she would have to pay for the maternity leave of the PhD candidate. And people in her research group complained to her about the research culture or the work environment in her research group. And as a response, he got into some rage and went from door to door, opening the door. Are you satisfied with working for me? Yes, great, boom, and next door. And this is an empathy researcher. Well, as a result, she didn't lose her job, even though I think it's illegal to forbid someone to be pregnant while working for you. But she was promoted away. She's not supervising any more PhD candidates, but she still has a position. She still has a salary, and she still does research. A case where things went a little bit better in terms of response, for instance, in the UK, a researcher was accused, and not just accused, but it was just shown with emails and stuff, that she was bullying, and as a result, the Wellcome Trust, the funding agent, withdrew the funding of $3.5 million, and obviously that's the game over for that supervisor or that researcher, which I think is a better response. In terms of sexual harassment, there was a report 1.5 years ago in the US by the NIH. It says inappropriate conduct, but it means mainly sexual harassment. And it showed that 40% of women in the research environment experienced sexual harassment at work, which I think I'm still surprised that such a high number can be achieved. Of course, ways to address these extremes, so let's hope that they are extremes, but if 40% of women report this, you would wonder how extreme it is, or how common it is again training, but also having, for instance, a code of conduct signed by the supervisors or by every employee. And if you break that, you can enforce actual consequences, because in a lot of these cases, it either cannot be proven or it's not illegal. I think it is illegal to tell someone that they cannot get pregnant, but bullying, depending on the exact behavior, is not illegal. But at least you should be able to fire these people. And if you cannot prove an individual case, if we've seen this in the media a couple of times now, if you have 10 people that complain, it's not a coincidence anymore. You can show a pattern and you can act based on a pattern. In less extreme cases, of course, if there's just a conflict between a supervisor and a PhD student, the current situation is that the PhD student will almost always lose. But there should just be proper arbitration procedures in place with a protocol for what happens, for instance, to data that was collected or to publications, authorships, and so on. Could there be a new supervisor which I mean, how do you divide the credit and the results of a project between a supervisor and a PhD candidate when the relationship has become so toxic that they cannot continue together? And this is very often in academia. Well, so much for supervision. Then another aspect that is definitely of impact on your mental health is, of course, your job security and your financial security. So in a lot of countries, it's common. I'm not sure how this is in Belgium. Actually, I think you also have a mix between either being on a contract, so being recognized as an employee, or being on a stipend. And with a stipend, you're often not socially secured, so you do not build up your pension. You do not have any entitlements when you lose your job for unemployment money. Or if you are from outside of the EU, you are not allowed to stay even in a country when your contract ends, and the time that you worked but wasn't recognized as worked, but as studies because it was a stipend, do not count to your visa status or all those kinds of problems. So a contract should just be the standard, in my opinion. Obviously, also because you're highly educated, I mean, a somewhat similar level to people of your educational level and your age should be appropriate. This is definitely not the case. And what's very, very common is the constant playing with temporary contracts of 1 year, another 2 years, another a few months, and so on and so forth, even though you know a PhD project will take a few years. And insecurity in general is a huge impact factor on mental health. So, and it impacts your ability to even get a loan if you want to buy a home, for instance, or to plan a family, plan having children. If you have a contract or like income security for 6 months, you're not going to do this. One other way, apart from making contracts the standard, having fairer payment, and so on. Another example that I wanted to mention is you can align the interests of a supervisor, an institution, and a PhD student. For instance, here in the Netherlands, there is one common practice, and it is tying the obtaining of a PhD by a PhD candidate to the financial situation of an institute. So you get, as an institute, you get a €50,000 bonus if someone successfully obtains their PhD, and your PhD is only obtained if you defend your PhD thesis, and that means having 3, 4, 5 peer-reviewed publications. And that's in the interest of everyone, because the institute makes sure that they deliver quality research, in this case performed by a PhD student, and the PhD actually gets the final result which they signed up for. I can't say, if you remember a few slides back, the prevalence figures for the Netherlands, that really helps here, but I am in the Netherlands, if that wasn't clear yet. But it definitely does increase the job security, and the Netherlands scores in the top 3 countries in Europe in terms of payment levels for PhDs. So it definitely doesn't harm. The third aspect I would like to discuss is work demands and work-life balance. So here there's a bit of a paradox, because most people who work in academia really like their job. There has been a Nature survey, and 68% of people are very satisfied with the kind of work they do. And there is obviously a positive correlation between being happy at work and experiencing positive emotion. But in reality, that's not what you see back, because there's always an unconscious impact of working too much or having a high workload on your mental and physical health. So people need to be aware of this. Like, even if they're like, I'm very happy with the work that I do, I'm very happy to work in the weekends or in the evenings, that's fine, that's great, but is it healthy? And for that, you need, like, some training could be advantage, or just some literature provision where people can read about the impacts of these kind of things on their health. People should be encouraged to take the holidays that they have. So for instance, when I was part of the PhD representation in Germany, people always asked for more holidays. You only got 20 in Germany. And when we made the demand to the directorship of the Max Planck Society, they would say like, well, you have your survey where people want more holidays, and we have our survey of the number of holidays that people actually take, and people take on average 12. So I would really call on everyone, take the holidays that you have, because then you can ask for more, and it's healthy. Another way to improve just flexibility is of course helpful for work-life balance. Remote working, part-time working, I think remote working is very common nowadays, obviously. But another very important aspect is your work-family structures. So having daycare at an institute, I mean, depends on the size of the institute. Of this, if this is possible, you can also have a contract with a private or a third-party daycare. Having financial support, so daycare support basically. And something that is more common in the US, for instance, having a network for partners. So if you move for your PhD or for a postdoc or for any other academic position, and you have a partner, it's nice if they can also have a bit of a prospect of being able to find work at that new location. And this is more common in the US, where they actually help the administration to find a job for the partner of a researcher. Career development is, I would say, after the supervisor, the most mentioned aspect for, or frustration point or worrying point for PhD candidates, which has to do with that we're educating in most Western countries a lot of PhD students or candidates, and only 13% of those continue to work in academia, even though 75% of them would like to. So we have this academic pyramid, I will come back to it later, that is way too steep. And uncertainty about your future career perspective. So people want to continue in science, but they know they have a high probability of not being able to, which is a obvious stressor for people. So a few changes that would improve that situation, of course, a cultural change, because there is definitely a culture that if you do a PhD, you should also have the ambition for continuing in science, whereas if you're not, that doesn't make you a bad PhD candidate. There should be more focus on transferable skills that could also be like things that you learn during the PhD that could also be useful for other career paths, and career counseling, career days. This is very linked to the section in which you work. So like I said, for instance, in the biological and medical section, it's one of the worst situations, because especially as a biologist, you're not perceived as desirable by companies, whereas you could be, but there should be more invested in also advertising the skills that PhD people have for companies. If you did your PhD in engineering or in law, I think you will not have any issue finding careers outside of academia. And as a psychologist, I think you're somewhat in between, depending on your research and on the exact skills that you developed. The almost final aspect on an institutional level is administrative and material support. It's a little bit of an umbrella term, but obviously you should have the resources to actually conduct your research. Otherwise, you will not be able to deliver well in your PhD. But what I would like to emphasize is also to make mental health an institutional or on an administrative level part of the institutional policy. So usually you have an annual checkup by your occupational physician, which could also include a psychological checkup. What's important is to have literature on the website of your university or your institute, or on your PhD representation organization, I mean, on every level, preferably, about healthy conduct, healthy work practice, but also where to find help when you need it. Because people that acutely need help are disabled in many ways, and it would be so helpful to have just on the company website or on the university website in this case, a list of where can I find professional psychological help, also in foreign languages, because most, like in most countries, more than half of the PhD candidates are from abroad. So it helps to at least have English speaking psychological help providers on the website, or also just self-help guides, and so on. Of course, in the more extreme cases, you should be aware of, like here, what I put on the lower right. This is for Belgium, the suicide prevention helpline. And on an administrative level, of course, minority groups should be protected, because those are most at risk for developing mental health problems in general already. I think I have some, here on this slide. Just to start with that, here on the lower right on this graph, you see the influence of yeah.
If you can finish in 5-7 minutes, because we have Q&A after. Thank you.
Yes, I'm almost at the end. Actually, this is the last of the aspects of on an institutional level. So belonging to a minority group influences your psychological experience in general, and on an institutional level or on a social level, you can also emphasize this. So first of all, I would really urge everyone, every university, every research institute to form a PhD representative body. Unfortunately, it's not common enough, but it really helps, because those are just like a group of 3 to 5, depending on the size of the institute, people that can detect problems and things that are going well, and provide solutions, and be in touch with other representative bodies about good practice and things like those surveys and so on and so forth. It's very important. Obviously, there's also social components, so organizing social events, helping foreign PhD students, but also people from national who maybe move to a new environment, to integrate, to have conversations about what's normal in your PhD, and to have like awareness initiative. I think in the last few years, this has really grown. Awareness initiative, maybe a bit too much, because almost every day is a new awareness day or month or week. But it really helps. It's very common in the UK and in the US. And it helps if you have 1 month a year where you, again, remind people and educate people on the importance of mental health and what you can do about it in the academic environment, for instance, to stop normalizing behavior like, oh, I worked this weekend again, or I worked until midnight. I mean, that happens sometimes, but if it happens on a structural level, which is the case in academia, it's not a good thing, it's a bad thing, and it shouldn't be normalized. Like I said, so that's it for the institutional level, and through this PhD representative body, you can really enforce it. On a systemic level, where it's very difficult to have an influence, it's important that things change, because obviously from the numbers, you can see that there's a bad work environment in academia in general. So like I mentioned before, you have the academic period, which now would be like this. So you educate a lot of PhDs, you have room for fewer postdocs, and almost no one can become a professor. But that pyramid can be more steep. In just educating fewer PhD students, yes, it's less cheap labor, but you're investing in people that will stay in academia, that will continue to work with the data they collected, that will continue to work with the methods that they were trained in. And I definitely believe that economically, it's even beneficial to pursue such a career path, or such a path in terms of organizational structure. Obviously, there's a lot of discussions about measure of success, whether you should focus on the number of publications, the journals in which was published, the impact factor, and so on. That's beyond the scope of this, but it definitely has an influence. If you cannot publish your replication studies or your null findings, I mean, this is a problem in science in general. I think there's a really important chance actually to change something in academia, and that's through funding agencies. So funding agencies are, for instance, already doing that with publications. So a lot of funding agencies are now demanding open access publishing, but they could also do this on a PhD supervision level. So for instance, now it's very common that if I apply for a job, I would have to have a reference letter from my PhD supervisor. But why doesn't the PhD supervisor, when he applies for millions of funding potentially, not have to have a reference letter from the people that worked for him, whether he's a good manager or a good leader, because you don't want to invest millions in people that are bad managers. And again, that has to do with leadership training and monitoring performance also. Career diversity, I think I covered that. And I think also mentioned that having consequences for misconduct in science. So for bullying, but also for making up data, all those things, I mean, we read about it in the news, but actually, if I publish something with completely made up results, I can get away with it. It's not criminal. I will not be employed in academia probably. Not even always the case. There's a case here in the Netherlands where someone made up all his findings and was fired, and 2 years later he was rehired, and then fired again because the newspapers were covering it. But I mean, there should be more consequences, criminal or at least professional, to scientific misconduct. I know I want to leave some time for questions, so I will not go into the personal improvement. I just want to say there's always a personal responsibility. There's always a personal aspect that is not directly a result of your work environment, but probably you're better experts at this than me. And I want to mention that, like I said, it's very important to have an institutional representative body and then to have a national representative body. So this is going well, for instance, in the Netherlands, in Germany nowadays. In Switzerland is a very good example. But then on a national level, you can ask, because you need to ask in the end your government maybe for higher salaries. And it's important. On a European level, we have a Eurodoc. Most people don't even know it, but they do exist. And yeah, I will not waste too much time on this. I would recommend all of these links that I posted here to visit for any help on psychological well-being in academia. And I would then I end with this slide. Here's an overview of some of the institutes or the organizations that are on a national level or on a European level involved in improving the work environment in academia. In Belgium, this is called Opportunitie Research. I hope you heard of it, and otherwise just check them out. I'm not familiar with them. But in English, they're called Focus Research. And yeah, then I would like to take any questions if there are any.